No, a really horrifying, like, put down the newspaper and do this crime happens basically every day in Canada. Canada has mismanaged itself beyond normal parameters on a number of areas. Canada is doing things far more extreme than anybody else in the world and suffering worse consequences. This perception of who we are is out of date and increasingly out of date.
Syd Fizzard for Rebel News here in Calgary, Alberta, and recently I attended the Canada Strong and Free Network. Right now, Canada sucks. It sucks really, really bad for all of us. You know it, I know it, everybody in the country knows it. Whether you're looking at the economy, the crime on our streets, trying to feed your family is getting tougher by the day. And in this report, I interviewed a journalist from the National Post, being Tristan Hopper, on his new book, Don't Be Canada: How One Country Did Everything Wrong All at Once. It was this problem Tristan was discussing at the Canada Strong and Free Network as one of their speakers. That's why I took him aside to ask him about his take on the failing state that is Canada.
Now, why did this happen to us? How did we go from one of the most boring, uneventful, peaceful, well-managed, and socially cohesive countries on Earth into a petri dish of dumb ideas? My grand unified theory is that an entire country decided to run absolutely everything on the honor system, and was surprised when this immediately sent everything to hell all at once.
The idea of the book was looking at all the ways in which Canada has mismanaged itself beyond normal parameters. So I think it's easy for Canadians to assume, yeah, we got a problem with our assisted suicide system, or we got healthcare wait times, or what have you, and just to assume that's part of a global trend. So it was me noticing that on a number of areas, Canada is doing things far more extreme than anybody else in the world and suffering worse consequences, which is quite surprising when people learn that. They assume Canada there's always going to be countries in the world that are doing worse than Canada, but on drug addiction, on the extremes of harm reduction, on sort of the extremes of gender self-ID, the book details ways in which things are happening in Canada that no one else is doing, and it's generally not to our benefit.
We'll run a criminal justice system that gives bail to everyone, and if you violate your bail conditions, we'll just give you bail again. We'll run an immigration system with little to no screening and with massive loopholes we refuse to acknowledge or address. We'll establish an entire legal framework based around the notion that your gender is whatever you say it is, and not give any thought whatsoever to how such a system could possibly be abused. We'll greenlight an assisted suicide regime with the fewest guardrails on Earth, and even boast about how we don't need any. In Carter v. Canada, the Supreme Court decision that set the guidelines for legal medical assistance in dying, justices casually dismissed the notion that such a system would ever yield scandals or abuse. This is a quote: "We should not lightly assume that the regulatory regime will function effectively." We got the idea that this was the enlightened way to run a country. We also lost any imagination for dysfunction. We had it so good for so long that we forgot this wasn't the natural state of things.
Why is it that it seems like these problems are bubbling up and there's no action that's helping?
Yeah, that's true. Things just keep getting worse. Really soluble things keep getting worse. I mean, the great example being just crime. I think a lot of countries would love to have a crime problem that's as easily solved as ours. You just ask any police association, anybody with any sort of direct frontline experience with the criminal justice system, and they'll say, it's pretty easy, find the 300 guys committing all the crimes and stop constantly letting them out of jail and giving them bail all the time. And yet we just can't because we're so entrenched in various intersecting ideas that just don't allow us to do that. So, me writing this book is, I think, the first part of dealing with a problem is admitting you have a problem. So I think it's important for Canadians to realize, and you've seen this just in the last couple of years, it wasn't too long ago when Canadians were still saying, we have the greatest healthcare system in the world. You even heard that from Conservative MPs in the House of Commons. No one's saying that now because within that 2 years, they've either had to access healthcare themselves, realized how broken it is, or they read a news story about a Montreal hospital having 2 people die in the waiting room of the ER. So that's a change. Once you kind of realize, oh, maybe there's something wrong with our healthcare system, then it makes you more amenable to how you can actually fix it. And a lot of our problems have been able to develop because this perception of who we are is out of date and increasingly out of date. A great recent example would be the Justice Minister, Sean Fraser, when Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre was talking about we need to increase self-defense laws. And he says Canada is not the Wild West. And it's just this idea that there's a vision in his head in which Canada is not the Wild West, and he's going to prioritize that over data showing that we are increasingly a Wild West of sorts.
Speaking of the Wild West, and specifically when it comes to writing a headline for an article that'll actually grab the attention of the general public, how do you do that when we've got headlines every day? For instance, there's one out of Ontario where there's a 12-year-old assassin who got off bail on the second time now. The headlines keep getting crazier. How do you retain attention from the general public?
I'm trying to, it is hard to retain attention on that. One way I try and go about it is to sort of point out to the general public that these are not anomalies. So whenever something like this happens, you can look at sort of, the local Reddit thread talking about this, and you'll have people say, I hope they throw the book at him for this, or this shouldn't be happening in this country, or something. People treating it as if this is something that rarely happens. And I'm trying to illustrate to people that no, a really horrifying, put down the newspaper and do this crime happens basically every day in Canada, and there's almost no circumstances in which, an appropriate or injustice will be served in that case. So people hear about a random murder or stranger attack in a downtown, and I say, smash cut to whoever did that is probably going to be charged with manslaughter. Prosecutors are not going to charge it very hard, and he's probably going to be free within 5 to 10 years. So this idea that you've been watching too much TV and you just assume that we have a justice system that is still able to, hand a 25-year sentence in those cases, it's just not happening anymore. So in those particular cases, I think I would advise other journalists, when you're writing about something like that, to try and highlight that this is part of a growing trend. This is horrifying. It's never happened to this particular neighborhood before, but it was going to happen somewhere because this happens every day now.
And you also, just for the viewers to note, at the National Post, you put out these really great reels on social media where you are, nailing these subjects.
You may have seen something like this around the internet, a claim that if you illegally cross the border into Canada, the federal government welcomes you with $224 per day. And it's kind of true.
How are you finding the younger audience, the younger Canadians engaging?
The younger audience is engaging quite a lot, actually. So something I brought up here in my speech is if you look at sort of poll numbers and you look at voting patterns, and you even look at sort of the way young people are acting, Canada's in a real weird situation, unlike, I think, almost any other Western country, in which you have the average 25-year-old Canadian is more likely to vote Conservative or favor a Conservative option than the average 7-year-old Canadian. That kind of dynamic doesn't really exist in any other Western country. So because of a bunch of things that are happening, you can't buy a house, there's a bunch of broken institutions. For some reason, the generation that's coming up is much more open to these ideas than, say, I was when I was coming up in the mid-2000s. We can write one thing for a newspaper audience that maybe isn't particularly young, do the exact same thing for a reel, and we're reaching an audience that hasn't even touched the print edition.
Canada was your model of how to do it. The international headlines we're making these days are not nearly as quaint. We're now the world's nightmare scenario for real estate unaffordability. We're the world leader in overdose deaths, with Vancouver emerging as the world's center for illicit fentanyl consumption. The BBC called Canada the world capital for auto theft. We're history's only country that declared itself guilty of an ongoing genocide. And we're definitely the only country whose prime minister did so at a women's conference and was met with applause and cheers. We have the only military on earth that mandates tampons in every men's washroom and disciplines any service member who jokes about it. A year ago, U.S. talk show host Bill Maher, a lifelong progressive, recorded an entire segment about how the United States should actively do the opposite of whatever Canada was up to. There's only one problem with thinking everything's better in Canada. It's not.
Where do people get your book?
Sutherland House puts it out so you can order it direct, Amazon, and we do have the audiobook coming out, read by me, and I have a pretty good voice. Usually that's not good, but I I think I read it quite well.
The situation that we find ourselves in is rapidly different from the one that we might have in our heads. Seeing Canada as what it used to be compared to what it is now is the stark difference here that I think many Canadians need to internalize if we want to diagnose the tragic state of Canada that we've allowed. For Rebel News, I'm Syd Fizzard. If you want to support our work, go to rebelfieldreports.com. That's the only way that we're able to cover these events. We are entirely crowdfunded through your support, not any dime from the federal government or any government for that matter. So if you want to support us, go to rebelfieldreports.com.